For the United States to have attacked Iran,
The U.S. hit 3 nuclear sites in Iran overnight.
bombing its key nuclear facilities,
A successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran.
you'd think it would have to have been very sure Iran was developing a nuclear weapon.
Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat.
Iran has all that it needs to achieve a nuclear weapon. All they need is a decision from the supreme leader to do that, and it would take a couple of weeks to complete the production of that weapon.
But how do they know? For a long time, Iran has said it is not building a bomb, at least not at the moment.
ولی فعلا ما بنایی بر رفتن به سوی بمب اتم نداریم.
So let's try to understand Iran's position and why much of the West believes it is a lie. Iran's nuclear program is one of the most closely watched in the world and has been for decades. The International Atomic Energy Agency spent years piecing together accusations and evidence from the 80s and 90s, which raised serious questions about whether Iran was trying to build a bomb. Its attempt to obtain uranium, transform that uranium into fuel, develop a detonator, model nuclear explosions, even pack a prospective bomb into the warhead of a missile.
The U.S. intelligence community has long assessed that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability. Prior to 2003, Iran gained critical knowledge about the type of explosive that's necessary to build a nuclear device.
But one key conclusion from the world's nuclear watchdog: whatever Iran was doing, this emphasis on weaponizing nuclear power, the nagging fear of the possible military dimensions of its nuclear program, it all came to a stop in 2003.
They have politics. And we don't fully understand the internal politics, but they had a real nuclear weapons program until 2003, and then it was revealed publicly, and for reasons that very few people understand, the supreme leader halted the program.
Iran's supreme leader would even issue an oral fatwa, a religious decree, forbidding the development or use of any kind of weapon of mass destruction.
President Bush has said, vowed, he will not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. Do you believe him?
Well, basically, we are not looking for working for the bomb. We believe that the time of the bomb and its effectiveness is behind us.
But nuclear power, energy, that's different. Iran claims it is very much interested in developing that because the country does have a serious energy problem. Aging infrastructure and heavier consumption that's led to recurring blackouts over the last several years.
واقعا تمام کارهای ما چون با برق داره انجام میشه لامپ
مسئولیتش که 100% با دولت هستش به خاطر اینکه اون موظفه که حداقل زندگی مردم که یه آب و برق دیگه امکانات دیگه که
Iran does have a nuclear power plant in Bushehr, right here on its southwestern coast, in operation for more than a decade. But let's take a closer look at what that plant does and whether it's plausible that Iran's nuclear program is, as they say, completely peaceful. An important thing to realize about any country's nuclear program is that there can be two components to it: making fuel or converting fuel into energy. A nuclear power plant, that makes energy. A uranium enrichment facility, that makes fuel. So one of the first things we wondered about Iran's energy needs was whether it is so truly dependent on nuclear power that it makes economic sense for it to make its own fuel. Because, just to give you an analogy, lots of people own cars, right? Very normal thing to own. It's much less normal, though, to own your own gas station, and it's even less normal than that to make your own gas. You could, but man, that's a lot of work, and the math wouldn't really add up, would it? So Iran's a big country, 90 million people, but the electricity it generates by nuclear power, just 1% of its total output. Natural gas represents the lion's share, and hydropower is a very distant second. So one thing that doesn't quite line up is Iran's massive expenditure of time, energy, and money, the billions of dollars, years of investment, and the procurement of highly sensitive, specialized equipment and expertise to enrich uranium, to make nuclear fuel from scratch.
Iran has likely spent hundreds of billions of dollars on their uranium enrichment program.
At the low end, I've heard as close to $100 billion over the last 25 years. But if you add all of the opportunity costs, including the U.S. sanctions and the international sanctions and export controls, it could be up to $500 billion.
And there is almost no nuclear-powered country in the world that does this quite like Iran does. Take France, with its 57 usable nuclear reactors. You know how many enrichment facilities it has to make the nuclear fuel it needs to power those reactors? Just one. How about Japan? 33 usable reactors, 1 enrichment facility. Canada has 22 reactors, and it does not enrich its own uranium at all. It buys it from the United States. Speaking of the US, it has more nuclear reactors and more nuclear weapons than any other country on Earth, but it too has just 1 enrichment facility. Finally, here's Iran. They've got 1 reactor, but at least 2 enrichment facilities, one of them buried hundreds of feet under a literal mountain, which the US just bombed, but where otherwise the outside world has had almost no way to reach.
Iran doesn't even need to enrich uranium domestically. It could join 23 other countries that forswear enriching uranium because it is not economic.
You got to ask yourself the question is, why does a nation with 1 single operating nuclear plant require an enrichment facility?
What hasn't quite added up for the international community about Iran's enrichment program is that they appear to be making far too little of the type of nuclear fuel that you would need to power a nuclear reactor. According to the latest numbers from the IAEA, but still prior to the airstrikes from Israel and the US, Iran's stockpile of reactor-grade uranium was just a little under 8,000 kilograms. For context, according to one nuclear industry association, that's far short of the estimated 27,000 kilograms you would need to keep a reactor of the size Iran has running every year. So for Iran to keep its Bushehr reactor running, it actually buys the uranium it needs.
Bushehr that's fueled by the Russians. So its immediate needs for domestically produced uranium are really non-existent.
At which point you might ask, what kind of nuclear fuel does Iran make? Well, again, according to the IAEA, Iran also has in its possession around 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Because uranium enrichment happens on a spectrum. Enrich that uranium to around 3 to 5%, you've got reactor-grade nuclear fuel, good for a power plant. But keep going all the way to 90%. That's weapons grade, good enough to make a nuclear bomb. And those 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium in Iran's possession, it's been processed to 60%.
Enriched uranium is used for civil purposes in nuclear programs, including as fuel for nuclear reactors, but not when it's enriched to 60%, or at least not in Iran. There's no civil purposes for that.
According to the IAEA's latest assessment, the fact that Iran is the only non-nuclear weapons state in the world that is producing and accumulating uranium enriched to 60% remains a matter of serious concern. And it's been a concern for a while. Leading up to recent airstrikes on Iran, there has been mixed messaging from the US government as to exactly how close it believes Iran is to making a usable nuclear weapon.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
That's Trump's head of national intelligence back in March, followed by a very sudden change in June.
And your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
By this point, Tulsi Gabbard had since amended her assessment to make clear that Iran could make a nuclear weapon within weeks to months if it wanted to. Now, the US government has never revealed what piece of intelligence it now has that has led it to do to Iran what no US administration dared to do in decades.
Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success.
But one critical consideration would have been that it wouldn't be that hard for Iran to continue refining its stockpile of 60% enriched uranium all the way to 90 weapons grade. Because the hardest part is simply starting the process. Once you've gotten going, it gets easier.
Once you go upwards of the 20% range, it's easier in many respects because the technology is the same.
Basically, all of the work is removing stuff at the beginning. Going from 60 to 90% is pretty easy.
In general, it's likely that Iran could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for up to 8 to 10 bombs within a matter of weeks. It could probably produce the first bomb's worth in just a matter of days.
But keep in mind, that's just the time frame to create the required fuel for a bomb. Then you have to turn it into a weapon that can be fired at an enemy far away. Iran is fully capable of building the type of ballistic missile that could, in theory, deliver a nuclear warhead. We've already seen non-nuclear versions of those missiles hit Israel. But there's still a lot of uncertainty around this question of once Iran makes weapons-grade fuel, how quickly it can make a launchable weapon of it.
Are you saying there that the United States did not see intelligence that the Supreme Leader had ordered weaponization?
That's irrelevant. I think that question being asked in the media, that's an irrelevant question.
No,
they have
that is
everything
the
they need
key
to build a
point
weapon.
in U.S. intelligence assessments. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it was.
No, it's not.
But setting that aside, here's what the U.S. knows, that there is a history of Iran hiding key elements of its nuclear program. There is a history of watchdog claims that Iran doesn't cooperate with inspectors. And if Iran's nuclear program was really just about nuclear power, there is a history of dots that don't connect. Uranium enrichment that shouldn't happen, wrapped in an economic model that makes little sense. But what may become a more important question over time than how close did the US think Iran was to making a nuke is how close are they now?
Early intelligence finds the U.S. strikes perhaps only set Iran's nuclear program back by months.
The answer to that, very few people know.